Let me just move to Philippa, and let me just ask, looking at a second Obama term, what is your judgment about the capacity of the United States, the capacity of the President, the powers of the President to try and resolve some of the institutional, economic and debt problems America faces?
I think it's highly unlikely that President Obama is going to be able to effectively address those issues, which is not exclusively his fault. That's a function of both sides refusing to negotiate. I think that the markets were right to sell down the stock market in the aftermath of the election because they had been too optimistic that somehow an Obama win would equal resolution of the debt problem. And in fact, what we have is something kind of like a Thelma and Louise moment where both Republicans and Democrats are daring the other one to go over the edge. And in fact, just today, Senator Reid announced that he's going to try to remove the so-called filibuster capability. In other words, to deny the Republicans the ability to stop or to impede progress on any issue in politics, which is going to make things extremely difficult. So personally, I think what will end up happening is the stock market will eventually realize how bad it is, that the president does not have the capacity to resolve the issue, and that we are going to go right up to the edge, if not over the fiscal cliff. We will have to shut the US government down for several weeks, maybe more than once, and that actually this needs to be priced in. It's not priced in, and Congress won't respond until the stock market forces them to. So I don't see the president really being able to override all that.
Well, that's a pretty pessimistic analysis that you've just given us. What it suggests is that the polarisation and the divisions in the United States political system, if anything, will just get worse. So extrapolating from that, what does that mean? Does this mean that you're a pessimist about America's prospects as we look out to the medium term, or not? And if you're not, what is the offsetting argument?
Well, I have to say, no, I'm extremely optimistic and have been about the United States. But having grown up in politics, my father served 4 presidents and I've served 2 presidents. When Washington gets itself into an impasse, it's not necessarily such a bad thing, right? The rest of the country can progress without Washington getting in its way. That's one way to think about politics as well. But bottom line is, the US is actually doing remarkably well. I mentioned in my talk earlier today about manufacturing returning from China. Just to put a little granularity on that, to give people a sense of how deep this is. Companies as diverse as General Electric, Otis Elevators, Caterpillar Farmland Equipment, Brooks Brothers, the suit manufacturer, I mean, even Whammo, that makes frisbees and hula hoops, have moved the production back to the United States. You know, ATM machines are being built in the United States again. It is broad and it is deep, and it is not going to be affected by whether Washington can sort out the debt issue or not. The United States is competitive again in a way it has not been for many years. But we also have a boom going on in agriculture, in energy extraction, and in mining. So overall, I'm very upbeat about what will happen in the US, but the innovation that's occurring isn't so widely recognized yet, and we're going to get innovation in politics as well. What we're seeing at the local level for governments is defaults, restructuring of the debt. It's just people want a top-down announcement. They want the president to announce they're going to fix the debt problem, when in fact what you're seeing is a grassroots, bottom-up kind of phenomena. So there isn't any one announcement. At the local level, people are addressing the outstanding issues.
Well, let me just ask you a further follow-up question before I go to other panel members. We've just had in this country an Asian century white paper. That is, the premise is that the coming century is an Asian century, and the focus has been very much on China. If you were the principal advisor to the Australian Prime Minister and able to go and seek advice on the future, Would you travel to China or would you travel to the United States, and why?
Well, call me biased, but I would be traveling to the United States.
Why is that?
But let me be clear. I've had this view now for several years that Australia has linked its future too exclusively to China. I'm not saying that China isn't part of Australia's future. I'm just saying it's not the only future for Australia, and that in fact having a diversified customer base is a smarter way to go, no matter what assets or services this economy is producing. And the fact is that we look at China today and what we see is a very troubled environment. I mean, one issue that didn't come up today I thought was interesting is, I don't know how much you guys have followed these events in Wuhan in China, where they've had the first spontaneous democratic elections in China since the communists came to power, which is a reflection of a grassroots response to the fact that the economy is not able to deliver a better future. And people are actually turfing out local officials and electing their own. So, you know, will the Chinese address this over time? Yes, absolutely. But I can see in the next decade, I would bet a lot more money that the US will figure out how to make profits and generate GDP faster than China will be able to sort out how to shift from an export-led economy to a domestic demand-led economy. That is a more than 10-year process. So I'm not writing off China. I'm just saying a balanced approach makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, well that's a very firm statement there of confidence in the United States. Let me now go to John Denton. John had a substantial input into the white paper. He's well acquainted with the arguments in the white paper. So my question to you, John, having heard what Philippa's got to say is, did the white paper get it wrong?
Well, can I just flip back before I answer that question? I just want to make a comment if I could about the US. Allow me the liberty.
Of course.
Because it's after dinner.
Well, that's not cool. No, I'm only too keen for you to talk on America.
I think that, and it's actually interesting to look at US politics, and I look at it from a slightly different prism, which is, what does it say about functioning liberal democracies? And one thing that you can discern, and in a way we can look at it a little bit here, but we can look at it also in Europe as well. We all have a proud tradition of liberal democracies. What you discern, though, is that there's a lot more goodwill that's actually required to make our systems work. And that when that goodwill gets sucked out, we've got some pretty creaky systems to keep pushing along, and they don't function that well. And I think you can see that as a case in point in the US, where the absence of the kind of goodwill that allowed the Congress to operate has actually been sucked dry, and it's become quite complex, and it's actually quite interesting. It's also quite interesting to look at that more broadly as to what it says about liberal democracies around the globe. And now, of course, you're confronted with situations where real choices need to be made, and those choices will require some substantive trade-offs, and parts of the system will now be sorely tested. And you start to see some of the challenges, particularly in Europe, where there was this sense that democracy was enduring, but when you start seeing the goodwill sucked away as the choices are made, it gets sorely tested. Just an observation more than a debating point.
It's an observation which raises all sorts of issues.
It wasn't trying to avoid the question.
No, I know you weren't on it. I wouldn't suggest for one moment you were trying to avoid the question. I understand that. But let's just to follow up on what you've just said. Do you think that these recent tribulations in American democracy that you're talking about, is this the new status quo? Is this just a period of transition? If you look at American history, America has had very substantial periods of deep tribulation, whether we're talking now about the Civil War, or if we're talking about the Great Depression, divisions in the 1930s, divisions in the 1920s even in the United States. So what's your judgment? Is it the new status quo, or is it just one of these phases that America goes through in its history?
I see it as a phase. I will now answer your question because I actually think that the story of America's demise is misunderstood and is just plain wrong. I think, and I was alluding to this in my comments earlier today, that if you think about sources of power in the 21st century, the key source of power is this thing called connectedness and interconnectedness. And I think that if there's an economy in the world that has that in spades, it's the US. It's the mere openness of it all. The fact that generation after generation of migrants come, businesses succeed, fails, sectors rise and fall, etc., and it keeps pushing on, says to me here is a power that will endure.
Okay, well this just raises further the question I asked, which you haven't really answered. I said...
I haven't finished.
well, good, because the question was, because I asked Philippa, should the advisor to the Prime Minister go to China or the United States to see the future? And she said the United States. So I therefore ask, have we somehow got the white paper wrong?
But I think that to allow a conclusion like that to settle is to misunderstand, one, the purpose of the white paper, two, its design, and three, the way in which it's balanced. And if I can say, the purpose of the white paper was never set out as a foreign policy document. Let's be very clear about that. It was really, how do you create an environment and a series of frameworks which can allow a discussion on continuing domestic reform to take place and make sense of it to people who are actually seeing things happen to them without being involved in the process of understanding why this is going on. And that's really the Australian public. I mean, what is the importance of Asia to us? Why is it relevant to them? Don't they deserve a discussion about their future? And in many respects, if you look at the way the white paper is framed, it sets up irrefutably the importance of the Asian century, and then tries to find a way to reach out and explain, well, how can we as a nation rise up to the challenges, be aware of the opportunities, also be aware of the pitfalls, but it will require more change, not less, and it will not necessarily be straightforward. It also creates a framework for us to have some of these debates about trade-offs. And that's when you get to the issue that you hear talked about. Should we trade off our values to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our democracy to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our relationship with the US to further integrate into Asia? I, by the way, don't believe the answer to the question is yes, yes, and yes. I actually think we need to have the discussion, though, because it's actually a much more vital part of the broader political discussion in Australia than I might have thought. There are senior people in this country who do think that we should trade off part of our relationship with the US as we look towards China. In many respects, I think if China had its dream outcome, that might be one of the things on it, but they don't expect to get that.